Welcome back to EDIT 640. It's Joe again here to present this week's module on location design. In this lesson, we'll learn basic scouting strategies for choosing good locations for shooting. We'll look at electrical power demands and learn why not all extension cords are created equally. We'll figure out how to assess a location for potential lighting and audio problems. We'll examine some fundamental prop management techniques. And finally, we'll finish with a review of the kinds of logistics issues that producers typically face. Designing an instructional production is a lot like real estate. Location can be everything. But the practical reality that virtually all teachers face is that they are not part of the Hollywood entertainment engine, and they'll never have the multi-million-dollar budget and large professional crews that are typically associated with blockbuster-level productions. No one will ever build an elaborate replica of an historic building, and George Lucas is not about to allow them to use any of his blue screen warehouses for creating those amazing virtual sets. Instead, teachers typically have to do virtually every job in the production workflow, and scouting existing sites to shoot is one of the most important. One of the most important outcomes of the scouting process is inspiration. When you're on site, whether it's an indoor site or an outdoor site, it allows you an opportunity to take a look at things like lighting and audio and imagine how you might block your characters or block your talent, where they would go in the set, what kinds of motions, what kinds of frame shots you would want, how you'd want to compose those images. And ultimately, this becomes inspiring content for you to use to help design the storyboards that you're going to sequence later on to tell your instructional production. So it's critical that you go to these sites, not just to see how cool they are, but to do it systematically so that you can look at all of these variables. Where's power? What's the lighting like? What's the audio like? And of course, what the props are like as well. But while you're there, make sure you go ahead and shoot photos, and shoot these photos in different frame sizes, and well, actually not frame sizes, but in different frame compositions, different shot types, so that you can again stimulate your thinking after the fact when you're reflecting on this later on after you've left the potential site and you're trying to figure out how this all works into your storyboard. Having those photos will be invaluable, as well as notes that help fill in some of the gaps about the information that is important or relevant to that site for your particular production. If you don't have a camera, of course, you can always sketch your shots and go old school with it, but have something visual in mind and produce something visual while you're there. A camera is usually the easiest, but certainly sketching can be a fallback if you need to. Also, while you're there, make sure you check to see what props are available. These may be very useful, and remember, props are not necessarily something small that you hold in your hand. They could be other larger items there that are relevant to the production. But go ahead and jot those down in your notes so that you know what's available and you have this information to reflect on while you're designing your storyboard. It's important that you have a power plan. When you get to a site, one of the first things you need to look for are the power outlets. Even if you're shooting everything from a battery-powered camera and it's fully charged, you still might need lighting. In fact, in most cases, you'll need lighting, whether you're indoor or even when you're outdoor, and this may surprise you. You will need lighting to supplement the natural light that's available, and that, of course, requires power. You may not know this, but there are multiple kinds of extension cords that you can use. Most of us know what a power strip is, but there are grounded extension cords and then there are non-grounded extension cords. And I want to show you the ones that are not recommended. Do you see this one here? That's not what we want to use. This is a non-grounded extension cord. Don't use those. Use the ones that have 3 prongs, and your equipment will be much safer. Also recommended, of course, is using a power strip so that if you ever experience a surge, it won't damage your equipment. Finally, you'll also make sure that the power load, especially if you're using older lights, which are power hogs to begin with, if you have incandescent bulbs, make sure that the facility can handle that kind of power, and you may have to do a test shoot before the actual live production begins. Nothing could bring production to a halt quicker than having bulbs blow or tripping surge protectors at the actual site location. And if you don't own that site location and you've simply gotten permission to use it, you might have some unhappy owners to deal with as well. So make sure you plan for your power. Lighting, of course, also takes significant planning in advance when you're designing your production. Now, it's important to note that we have a complete module on lighting later on in the course. But for now, there are a few things that we need to focus on in the design phase. Later on in the production phase, we'll spend a whole module studying this. But for now, focus on when you're on site scouting a particular location, whether it's indoor or outdoor. Think about the light source. Think about the angles that the light hits your subject, your prospective subject, or your actors, and then the resulting shadows that are in the room, outside, and where they might be during the actual production. You have to keep this in mind, especially if it's at a different time of day. What you're after here is trying to understand this concept of light temperature, and we'll talk about light temperature later on. That's a more advanced topic, but it has to do with the way light feels natural as it's displayed on a subject's face. You all know that a fluorescent bulb shining on an actor would look very different than an incandescent bulb. Those two different types of lighting are a result from different temperatures, and we'll talk a lot more about that in a later module. Just know that when you're on site, take some notes about what you're going to use for light sources and what the angles are that might work well for the kinds of shots you need. For example, in this particular shot right here, this is a classic dilemma for producers. You've got natural light coming in through the windows, and then you're augmenting it with some electrical lights to front light your subjects. The light coming in through the windows, if there's no other light on in the room, or even if there's an overhead light, it won't be sufficient to light their faces, so you have to front light them. And this is a very common issue. And this is true outside as well. For example, in this particular photo, you can see how they're supplementing with these great big, now keep in mind this is a vintage photo, but they're shooting the subjects here with very powerful outdoor lights to create a particular effect that they think they need, especially given that this was shot on an overcast day. So keep that in mind. No matter if you're indoor or outdoor, you're probably going to need a lighting strategy. Okay, let's switch over and talk about audio right now. And I'll preface this saying that just like the lighting module, we have an entire audio module to do later in the course. But for now, as part of the location design process, it's really important to think about a few questions that you'll need to answer as you're designing these productions and thinking about where you want to shoot this and how you want to set things up. So to begin with, let's talk about a term here that you may or may not have ever heard of, and that term's called room tone. Room tone refers to the ambient noise that exists on site, whether it's indoor or outdoor, when nobody is talking. In other words, what do you hear in the quote-unquote background noise? That's called room tone, and room tone can be very effective patch material to layer underneath other audio tracks to help smooth transitions and crossfades. In fact, your homework assignment that accompanies this module will have you work on an exercise in which you use room tone to do exactly that. So see the homework assignment for more details with that. But for right now, let's talk about the differences in ambient noise that you might have in a sequence like this, shot in a forest. You can imagine when nobody's talking here, you get typical forest sounds. Contrast that with what you might hear in the room tone of a busy restaurant. Now, you might have some of these customers mic'd, sitting down at a table, engaged in a conversation, and that's your primary audio track. But in the background, you have the actual audio sounds that you would hear in a normal restaurant. People talking quietly, forks banging against plates, glasses chinking together, and other typical noises. That room tone is very, very different from what we would have heard previously, as is the room tone that you would have in a studio setting. In this particular case, you're probably not going to hear very much, but you will still hear different hums and HVAC, electrical, static, what we would typically call white noise, especially if there are fluorescent lights involved. Typically, the overhead fluorescent lights that we're used to in industrial settings have a buzzing or a hum that's very audible, depending on the types of lights that are being used. And as a result, you as the producer need to think about this in advance when you're evaluating sites. Don't just go there and think about how you might visibly shoot the scene. Think about how the scene is going to sound and what are the different kinds of tone sources that you're going to have to deal with. In many cases, these can be filtered out using the digital audio editing capacities, but in others, you may have to get creative. And using room tone to cover up crossfades is a very common strategy, and you'll learn about that in this week's homework assignment as we talked about. Let's talk about acoustics, though. Every room and every outdoor setting will have a different acoustic signature. And this is especially apparent in studio shoots or any type of indoor shoot. Some rooms are considered very hot. Others are considered very cool. And audio engineers use those terms to describe environments that are very echoey. They call those hot environments. And this is really easy to tell. If you clap your hands inside a typical industrial building with cinder block walls, you'll hear a very minor echo that sounds very sharp. Those are hot rooms. Cool rooms, like the one you see here, usually have some type of sound dampening material. In this case, it's the curtains that you see up there on the wall, as well as the sound dampening fabric panels that you've got up on the ceiling that surround the room. All of these are designed, obviously, to optimize the acoustic signature, and usually that means reducing echoes and lowering the audio temperature of the actual room. So again, when you're estimating or evaluating these sites on location, thinking about how you want to design your production, make sure you take into account whether or not the room is very hot or very cool. Okay, let's switch to our next topic. Let's talk about props. Most of you probably know that props is shorthand for property. And we're not just talking about props that you can hold in your hand. All of these locations that you're going to be evaluating will have, to some degree, a variety of props available that you can use in your shots. They don't necessarily have to be movable. They could be permanent. And these are all things to consider as you look at the potential designs. But they will obviously be entirely dependent on the actual location. In most cases, you'll be making decisions about studio locations versus field locations. And it's important to understand that when we're talking about studios, obviously those are very, very contrived in their design. They typically have the following equipment, usually. They have some combination of desks or chairs. Sometimes the subjects are actually standing and leaning into a table, and other times they're just standing there alone. There is no table. But most of the time, we tend to have some type of furniture device that serves as a centerpiece, especially if there are multiple speakers or multiple subjects on camera. One of the most important objects, of course, is the background. And in a studio setting, these can be highly contrived, and we end up seeing in most journalistic types of productions very aesthetically pleasant types of backgrounds. You also, in instructional videos and informational videos, especially in news videos, a lot of times you'll see an LCD or LED monitor in the background. Sometimes they refer to it. They might actually be standing in front of it like Wolf Blitzer does in the CNN Situation Room, or it's a smaller monitor like the one that we have here, and it just has either eye candy on it, or it might have keywords of text that just serve as cues to the viewer. In any event, the point here is that studio environments are very contrived in their design, and that's all deliberate. When we move into the field, however, one of the most important props to consider is the background. And we don't always think of the background as a prop, but clearly you can see in this particular shot here, this is a terrible background for this particular shot. We have a speaker holding the microphone standing in front of lots of other people and lots of other buildings. And depending on how wide that shot is, that person could easily be lost in the production. For these types of situations, they may have different contexts, and it may be important for this person to be here in front of the crowd. They may be talking about the particular event that's being celebrated here, in which case the best practice would be to take a very close shot of the speaker, a medium shot or closer, so that you don't lose them in a long shot as just another bystander. Contrast that with what we have in a shot like this, where you have a much simpler background. You have a speaker in front of this wonderful greenscape background with a few trees. Very, very well designed. Note also that you actually have a light stand right here, providing supplemental key lighting. And again, we'll learn all about lighting strategies later on in the course in its own module. But it's important for you to know right now, when you're going to these sites and evaluating their locations, you've got to give serious thought to choosing backgrounds. And a lot of times this simply depends on which angle you point the camera. You might have the subject stand over on one side and you've got a great background shot, whereas the other, it might be up against something undesirable that's not relevant or distracting to the actual production. And again, remember, with lighting, even in an outdoor shot, you're usually going to supplement your lighting either with reflectors or with portable light stands like you see here. And it doesn't have to be something terribly expensive. We'll talk about that in the other module. Here's another example of a high contrasting background. You can see in this particular studio shot from a Red Cross CPR video, you have a giant roll of white paper that is underneath, rolled up, and fills the background of the image up above the subject's head, just out of frame. And the effect of this is really twofold. Number one, it simplifies the background, and number two, it provides substantial contrast so that the viewer can focus on just what the subject is doing. Or really, there are two subjects in here. You've got the dummy and then the person demonstrating proper CPR form. This practice is very consistent with what we know about multimedia learning theory, which, among other things, states very simply that if you put distracting graphics in the background, learning is diminished. So not all of us are going to have a giant roll of white paper, but you might have a background that is simple in nature. It could be a wall, it could be a side of a building, or it could be anything that is simple. If I were you, I would give serious thought to using that as the backdrop for your instructional images so that the viewer is focused on the subject and not what's happening actually in the background. Another prop convention that we see a lot in various industries involves the positioning of mobile props. And we see this a lot in the cooking show genre, where obviously you have a significant amount of props that are used in demonstrating a particular recipe and how to put some of these dishes together. They're usually placed in the forefront of the frame so that they're very easy for the viewer to see while not blocking entirely, anyway, the subjects who are doing the actual demonstration. Very common in cooking shows. We also see this a lot in infomercials. I'm sure you recognize these folks. You may not remember Tony Little by name. He's the ponytail, mullet-haired fellow right there, quite famous for demonstrating all kinds of different products that he's selling. And we also, of course, have seen this in the ShamWow guy. I don't even know what his name is, but we certainly know the product, the ShamWow. And the whole point that I'm trying to make here is that the props, in this case, are very relevant to the entire production, obviously, and they need to be presented at the forefront of the frame. So let them occupy a prominent position as you establish the composition of your frames. And of course, in the safety industry, we see props a lot, in this case, a fire safety video. And it may not be in the forefront because we certainly don't want our subject to get burned here, but it occupies a major part of the frame. So as you think about your frame composition, where you position the subject relative to the actual prop becomes very, very important. So as you're scouting these locations, thinking about these designs, you always have to think about how to frame the subject with whatever is relevant in the background or in the props that are available. We also see this a lot in the audio enthusiast shows, where they're typically showing us a process that involves tools and gadgets and components to repair or upgrade your cars. And they typically, they're very formulaic. They present the parts up front so that you can see them. Sometimes they'll hold them up and explain them. And then they'll cut away to a shot where they're actually using those parts and installing those parts. All the while, there's some type of narrative track underneath. So again, the key takeaway here is to arrange your props for good visibility and always think about how you're going to compose your frames when you're scouting these locations. Let's switch over and talk about logistics right now. Here's some key questions that you'll need to be able to answer and think about while you're scouting these different locations. The first of which, of course, is scheduling. When can you get access to this site? Is the scheduling dependent on somebody else's schedule? For example, your subjects. You might be able to get access to it when it's available, but your subjects may not be available at that same time. Another important question to think about is the role that the weather plays. What is the weather like on the day when you're shooting versus the day you're scouting? Especially if this is an outdoor shoot. Sometimes even indoor shoots are weather dependent. If it's sunny and you've got lots of windows inside the room, like we saw in that one shot earlier, that will impact the way you light your image. So that's very, very important to think about. If it's raining one day, does that impact your production? Do you have shelter outside if it's an outdoor shot? What about your equipment? How do you protect your equipment? So obviously, think about, as you're scouting out these locations, what your weather plan is. Clearly, it's also important to allow extra time for setup and cleanup, so factor that into your scheduling as well. When you're on site, blocking or thinking about blocking is critically important. Where will you put your subjects? As you start imagining the kinds of frame compositions and shot types that you might use in your production, you logically have to think about where to put the actual subjects, the on-screen talent, the props, the large permanent props, immobile props, the mobile props. Where does all this stuff go? And you can draw quite literally maps in your head and then sketch them out on paper so that you have a general idea about where everybody needs to go within a particular frame. And as we said earlier, make sure you write this down, make sure you take notes, and make sure you take photos. What do you do if you're shooting in a public area? If it's a restaurant or a museum or some other interior space that's public, or if it's an outdoor space as well, like some of the shots we saw earlier in this webcast? How do you deal with them? How do you prevent them from walking in the middle of your shoot? I can remember for one project where we were shooting instructional videos in a mall one time. We had people constantly interrupting our shots because we had the camera too far away and zoomed in. People kept crossing in front of us, and so we had to make adjustments accordingly. These are the kinds of dynamic decisions that you'll have to make during production day, and they can always be much more efficient if you think about them or try to anticipate them in advance. Obviously, some sites might require special permission, and they may even require permitting, especially if they are in a proprietary establishment where you're subject to the whims of the owner. Make sure you thoroughly research this, and if the logistics are too difficult or too cumbersome, you might consider finding a different location. That concludes Module 6 on location design. Please take these things into consideration, and don't forget to check the corresponding homework assignment on Room Tone.